Theme park workers of Reddit, what are your horror stories? We were walking around the amusement park, wasn't open, in Mosul, Iraq, looking for a mortar team that was reported to be in the area, and a sniper took a couple of shots at us. Does that count? I used to work at a small water park where there were some dry rides up the southern end. There was this 8-year-old kid just being a little sheet, pushing in line, climbing up the slide of the playground, knocking other kids' hats off. That sort of bullshit. I warn him several times, then ask him to leave, but he doesn't. I go and ask my supervisor what to do, and he says get the scissors. He means to cut his wristband, without which he can't go on any rides. I call him over, and he surprisingly complies. And before he can react, I grab his wrist and cut off his wristband. Naturally, he starts crying like a rig. He runs off to get his mum, and she comes back about 15 minutes later and comes and talks to me, without her son. She asks why I did what I did, and I explain the situation to her, and how it is standard procedure. She nods and understands, and knows that her son is a demon child. She leaves. But, lo and behold, 10 minutes later here he comes. He tries to cut in line again, and I stop him and ask him to go back to his mum. His first reaction was to punch me in the gonads. Oh shit. No, he didn't. My supervisor sees and immediately calls security. Apparently his mum saw too, and she comes running. She doesn't say anything to her child, but goes and tells the supervisor to scare him. When security arrives, 30 seconds later, they grab the kid, whirl him around and handcuff him. He's sheeting himself at this point. They grab him and take him off in their golf cart. A few minutes later they return, and the kid has obviously been crying. And hard. He jumps out of the cart and runs straight to his mum, who grabs him and walks out. People watching were stunned. But amazingly, and I shit you not, some applauded as they went off. Best day of work I had at that place. Operated rides for 4 years. 2 moments stand out. The scariest moment I had was when lightning struck a utility pole below me. My position on the ride was about 50 feet up, knocking out power to my ride and forcing me and my supervisors to unload the ride in the middle of a lightning storm. The second was a guy who was very upset that I wouldn't let his kid, who was a foot under the height requirement, ride. I told him no early in the day, but one of my co-workers let the kid ride while I was on break. The family comes up later, and the father, who was noticeably drunk, jumps 2 gates and over the tracks to threaten me with a knife. I called security and he ran. I don't work in a theme park, but at Carolines, an NCSC amusement park, they have this Halloween thing called Scare-O-Wines or something like that. Employees dress up in these scary costumes and run around scaring the visitors. A big rule there is that you cannot touch them and they cannot touch you. This is the story of the time I broke that rule. So my brother and I were waiting in line for a kiddie ride of some sort when out of the blue some guy dressed in a zombie wolfman costume comes up and scares us. In fear I screamed and punched the guy in the face as hard as I could. He screams in pain because I had just broken his nose. Security gets called. They take my picture while the police and amusement park security talk to my dad and the injured employee. I can't much remember what happened afterwards other than telling the police officer what I did and having to say sorry to the employee. As of 2006 I am not allowed back at Scarewines until 2016. Yep. This is what happens when you scare a 9-year-old girl. You end up with a broken nose and a hurt ego. By the way, I can go to Carolines, but my dad won't let me or my siblings go since the incident. TL. Doctor, I broke a guy's nose at 9 and am not allowed back at the theme park until I am 19. I once worked at a water park as a lifeguard supervisor, and it was an everyday thing that someone shit or threw up in the pools. We even called it a code brown, so we weren't straight up saying oh yeah. Another turd in the kiddie pool. Another time we had a riptide water ride where people could ride bodyboards like a big wave, and while I was talking to another guard I heard the whistle go off like there was an emergency. As I approached, a guard told me that there was a nail in someone's foot. I thought he meant someone stubbed their toe and their nail pushed back into their toe, but it was an 8-year-old girl who had stepped on a 4-inch screw left over from the maintenance the ride had recently undergone. Right into the heel. As I saw it, I got a little lightheaded, but that what I was trained to do, so as I picked her up and pulled her out of the water, she moved her foot and it started to come out, but it was still in there a good 3 inches. I put a latex glove on it and told her it'd be okay as I called for paramedics. Her damn brothers came up and said that she was gonna ruin their time if they had to leave, and I had to tell them to get away. When the paramedics came, they picked her up to put her on the stretcher, and when they did, that good old latex glove slid off her foot and got hooked on the screw in the foot, causing her what I believed by her screams. Excruciating pain. Never found out what happened after that, but she should have sued. Big payday. I worked for the Halloween events for a theme park in my area, won't say the name, but it might be on the border between 2 states. I got kicked in the face and almost broke my nose. I was given a break for as long as it took for my nose to stop bleeding, and that counted as my only break for the evening. We got under 30 minutes of break time for a 8-hour shift. Another guy actually got fired because he had a migraine and had to go to the first aid area until it was over. It took something like 2 hours, and they fired him for it. We were also the maze closest to the only place that served alcohol in the park, so we had to deal with drunk assholes and shitty kids fairly often. Someone choked a girl working in the maze. The maze almost burned down a few times because assholes decided that a dried corn maze was a good place to smoke a ducking cigarette. I had a lot of fun most of the time, but I had to deal with a bunch of stupid shit on a nightly basis. Well, there was the one time a kid was decapitated after trying to get a hat that fell off during a roller coaster. I imagine that is pretty scarring. Never had a lot of horror stories, as a lot was quite safe. But before I worked there, a woman went on stealth, very fast and very high, and it hit a bird mid-flight, and part of its beak went into her arm. But apart from that, the constant sick. I don't know if these count as horror stories as there's no injury or gore involved, but here's a couple things that happened to me while interfacing with the theme park going public. I was managing a few ride photo booths and I was in one of them talking to an employee when a guy looked at our prices, picked out the package of 4 photos for $20, and said $20 for 1 photo? That's unfair to families. I told him that the price was $20 for 4. And if he'd like a single photo, it was $10. He got very close to my face and growled, "Are you getting smart with me?" I told him no. Tried to walk him through the different prices, and he kept saying, "Are you getting smart with me?" Finally I just walked away round to the back of the booth to check on some stock, during which point he told my employee that if he saw me again, I was getting punched in the face. TLDR, guy wanted to punch me in the face for telling him the prices. Another time a guy dressed as a ninja kept riding the coaster over and over with his mom and dad, which was strange enough. But on the 3rd or 4th time around, his mom whipped out her bobs and in the photo he was staring at them pretty intently. Security escorted them out. There's an amusement park in my town. It's supposedly haunted, according to some hotshot that was in my school class. I called bullshit. He insisted it was true. So my friends and I went to go check it out. There was supposedly a ducking phantom roaming the park. So we're walking around. We hear something, and I swear to God a ducking maniac came out of nowhere. We freaked the duck out, but it started laughing. Turned out it was 2 kids from our class who overheard our conversation and were trying to mess with us. So we continue the search. What do you ducking know? Another ducker dressed exactly like them comes out of nowhere. We freak out. Turns out to be the kid that told us the myth. By now, we've debunked it. So we start leaving. On our way out, yet another person jumps out dressed the same way. So ducking original. We were all tired. We knew it was someone messing with us. So we go to pull the dude's robe. Except there was no ducking kid in there. It was some weird fleshy body and it started to yell at us. Not to mention they all had a stick of salami for a leg. Duck in Retroland. Man. We take care to make sure everything is as safe as can possibly be, so I haven't had many horror stories in my time working at a theme park. The only thing that comes to my mind is all the times parents itch at you when you tell them their child isn't tall enough to ride, or when someone makes a scene when you have to politely tell them they are too large to ride and must get off the ride because they don't fit. The worst thing that's happened is a guy spitting in my face and starting to film me with his phone while screaming at me that he was going to sue the company I work for because I confronted him when he tried to trip one of my performers during a Halloween event. He was drunk. He was arrested. We all laughed at his mugshot the next day. One time I saw a pigeon get obliterated by someone's face on one of those pendulum rides that spin and swing. It landed just in front of me. In the queue. And its claw grabbed the air in its last motion as a trickle of blood ran off the edge of the ride and into the water underneath. The worst part was when its little pigeon lover was looking out sadly from their nest, which they decided to make in the triangular legs of the ride. Worked at a Six Flags as a sound technician. So I spent most of my time backstage with the characters and actors. One time I walked backstage to find a headless Bugs Bunny and Scooby-Doo having sex. Costumes just unzipped. Not off. Not exactly a horror story, but definitely scarring. My first job out of high school was at a theme park. Nothing crazy. Just a lot of poop. Kids would poop on rides. Adults would poop on rides. It was a daily poop fest. At the time I was under 18, so it was always awesome when it happened because I had to shut the ride down and call in for cleanup instead of doing it myself. Diarrhea on a roller coaster is not fun for anyone on the ride. Used to work graduation parties at a water park. This one kid had the bright idea to do a ton of Drew Gus, don't know what kind, behind the putt-putt windmill. A short while later, a hypnotist came as part of the entertainment for the school's all-night party. This kid happened to get hypnotized and was simultaneously on a ton of Drew Gus. I'm not an expert on hypnotism, but it takes a pretty heavy toll on your brain. Shortly into his hypnotic state, he went nuts. Shaking. Convulsions. Looked like a ducking zombie movie. Scary as shit. Blacked out. Out cold. Went to the hospital and apparently was in critical condition for a few days. Happened in front of the whole school. Party was cancelled early. Tons of leftover pizza for me and my co-workers. Plus time and a half pay. Sweet night. Getting abused by a manger. Almost raped by a co-worker. Pay wages held. Vomit. And kids fested with pink eye as a prince at Disneyland getting punched. And spit on as a Horror Nights chainsaw clown. Walking up those ducking escalators after the park closes. Having needles go through my fingers. Boredom. Ducking tourist in your way. Walking for miles. And jealous employees as a costumer for Universal. Then there's his parking. Drama. Terrible managers and cheaty wages that goes for all theme parks. All in all, there were also some great memories to be shared. Zero regrets. Edit, spelling. I had a friend who worked at Great America for years. His most gruesome story was about the day he pissed off the boss and got assigned to clean the bull pit. Just the sheer tonnage of shit. Never. Again. Former Disney World cast member here. Brazilians. Lots and lots of Brazilians that swarm you. Be rude and obnoxious. Hate them, but hey, they are basically set up camp in the summer here. Lots of stories, but I was working at Club Cool and talking to another cast member when I see in the corner of my eye some dad undo his daughter pants and let her squat on our floor. Had to mop that stuff up. Not a horror story or anything. I worked at the biggest theme park in Toronto. I was a ride operator in the dead of summer. We would switch between 2 or 3 rides in our area. I operated a roller coaster and swings. The booth we sat in for the coaster was air conditioned. I loved being at that ride. But the swings had a booth about the size of a porta potty. One window. The window was stuck and it was about 35 Celsius without the humidex. I ended up fainting after I was in there for about 20 minutes. As I passed out, I whacked my head on the control panel, giving me a concussion. After that event they started bringing huge jugs of water to each ride if it got over 30 C. TL. Doctor passed out in the heat and the company changed policy for it. I worked as a lifeguard for a while at a water park. The wooden building behind the wave pool caught on fire one day, probably because of an employee smoking in there. The park had to be evacuated and people were passing out in the parking lot left and right since it was about 100 degrees outside. The building burned down, along with all of the ride tubes that were stored in there. It was one of the worst days I've ever had to work. On top of working 11 to 14 hour shifts every day with maybe a day or if I'm lucky 2 days a week off. There wasn't any ducking overtime pay. I was 16 working this summer job, and it was owned by SeaWorld Parks and Entertainment. Not Water Country but the other. I was threatened of being sued by an Indian family. I was giving him coffee and he promptly squeezed the top of the cup, popping the lid off. He got a little splash on him, yelled shit and let go of the cup and spilled everything else on my arm. Sure it hurt but maybe for a second or two. I asked him if he was okay but he was saying no as if it were the end of the world. Demanded a supervisor and park meds were called, then his brother came and said they were going to sue for thousands. I got workers comp though. I got offered ointment lol. Some guests are just obnoxious. I saw a family of a mom, dad, brother, and sister. The boy was about 9 or so. The mother was furiously yelling at him because he didn't want to ride the roller coaster. It went something along the lines of, "Are you gonna do it or not? Stop being a ducking pussy or we'll just ducking go home." I was pissed for the rest of the day. Universal Orlando FL. Mid-2000s severely handicapped kid strapped into an electronic wheelchair hits forward when he shouldn't have and goes flipping over into the mid-ride vehicle. Goes also completely upside down, semi-pinned under his chair. Chaos ensues. They pull the kid out and he was okay. But the "I'm going to hell" section of my brain was laughing its sickers off as this all unfolded. Worked at a Paramount Park several years back as a lifeguard. The grossest part is that the giant wave pool is not drained refilled all summer. By the end of the summer, when the wave pool was turned off at the end of the night, you could see sunscreen oil slicks on the surface and all of the band-aids and hair ties would settle into a giant disgusting mass. A few times I saw guards go in after money, but I can assure you it wasn't worth it. After the water park closed, I filled in on rides duty. One time I filled in as a height checker because the girl who did it before me had her arm broken by a psycho dad who tried to take her wristbands, which were used to indicate kid's height, from her for his kid who was too short to ride safely. Worked at a theme park for 7 years. Past few have been in the water park area. We have a slide that is about 100 feet tall, and rockets single riders straight down and into a lengthy trough at the bottom. Last summer we had an issue where the water levels were incorrect. For a few weeks it was too low, and guests were complaining about their backs getting scratched, so the plumbers raised the water level. However, being that the slide rockets you at an ungodly speed, this created a bidet effect on people who rode the slide. One woman came down and just laid in the trough, waving one of the lifeguards down. When they reached her, she was screaming that a massive amount of water went up her anus and into her stomach. We called the paramedics and they had to take her to a hospital.